dirt is still loose. Morning light has barely touched the cemetery when the first person notices it. The grave should be smooth, fresh soil packed down carefully the night before. Family members had stood around it in silence as the last shovel of earth fell over the coffin. But now the ground looks wrong. Someone kneels beside the mound. The soil has been disturbed, not by weather, not by animals, by hands. A thin groove runs through the dirt where a shovel has cut straight down through the night. The mound is uneven now, as if someone dug quickly and tried only half-heartedly to cover the hole again. The woman standing beside the grave lowers her shawl from her face. For a moment she says nothing. Then she whispers a single sentence that spreads through the small gathering like wind moving through dry leaves. The coffin. 2 men step forward. They begin pushing away the loose soil, not with tools, just with their hands. The dirt comes away easily because it was already moved hours before. Someone else kneels, someone else begins digging. Within minutes they reach wood, the top of the coffin. One man presses his palm against it and stops. The lid is not sealed, it shifts under his hand. He lifts it slowly. Inside, nothing. The coffin is empty. The woman behind him lets out a sharp cry that echoes through the trees, because everyone here knows something terrible has happened. The body was buried yesterday. Everyone saw it. Everyone watched the coffin lowered into the ground. But during the night someone came back and took the dead. The silence that follows is not confusion. It is recognition, because this is not the first time. Someone in the back of the group speaks quietly, almost unwilling to say the words out loud. Night doctors. The phrase hangs in the air like a warning. Stories about the night doctors had been moving through enslaved communities for years. By the early 1800s, people whispered about them after sunset, especially in cities and plantation towns where rumors seemed to travel fastest. They were said to come in the dark wagons moving quietly through empty streets, men carrying shovels and lanterns. Sometimes they took bodies from graves. Sometimes, people said, they took the living. No one was sure where the stories began, but almost everyone had heard them. Children were warned not to wander after nightfall. Families buried their loved ones quickly, sometimes placing heavy stones over fresh graves to discourage disturbance. Because once the night doctors came, the stories said, the body would never be seen again. Now step back into that cemetery, because the fear standing around this open coffin did not come from imagination alone. The group of mourners continues staring into the empty box. Someone crosses themselves. Someone else backs away slowly. The woman who had lowered her shawl now covers her mouth with both hands. A body disappearing from a grave carries a special kind of terror. The dead are supposed to remain where they are placed. Burial closes a chapter. It brings quiet. When the dead vanish, something sacred feels broken. But for many black communities in the early 19th century, this was becoming a pattern. Bodies disappearing, graves disturbed, dirt freshly turned before sunrise. Sometimes the missing person had been buried only hours earlier. Other times a grave opened weeks after burial revealed the same terrible absence. The stories spread quickly. People said men with wagons worked the cemeteries at night. They moved quietly, digging fast, removing the body, then covering the hole before sunrise. The wagon wheels left faint tracks on nearby roads. By morning, the thieves were gone, and with them, the dead. Fear does strange things to the human mind. when something terrible happens repeatedly without explanation. Imagination fills the empty space. Some people believed the night doctors practiced dark magic. Others believed they worked for powerful men in distant city. Still others said they were surgeons who needed bodies for terrible experiments. But in most cases, the stories remain just that, stories. Whispers carried through plantation quarters and city streets. No one standing around the grave this morning has proof of what happened during the night. They only have the evidence in front of them. An empty coffin. The man who opened the lid closes it slowly. The sound of wood meeting wood feels final. Summono suggests digging deeper. Maybe the body shifted when the grave collapsed. Maybe animals somehow disturbed the burial. But no one truly believes that the soil around the coffin tells its own story. The cut marks from a shovel are clear, straight, deliberate. This was not accident. This was work. The kind of work done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The kind of work done quickly. The kind of work done in darkness. A boy standing near the edge of the group speaks suddenly. My uncle said they use wagons. The adults turn toward him. He continues, nervous now that everyone is listening. He said they come from the city. At night they dig fast, put the body in the wagon, and ride away before morning. No one laughs, because everyone has heard something similar before. The fear grows heavier. If bodies can be taken from graves this easily, burial no longer guarantees safety. Even the dead are vulnerable. Summono suggests posting watchers at the cemetery at night. Another person suggests building stronger coffins. Another says the only protection is to bury loved ones deeper. Each idea feels desperate because the real problem remains unanswered. Who would want the bodies badly enough to steal them? The name Night Doctors offers no explanation. It only gives shape to the fear. Later that evening, as the sun sinks behind the trees, a different kind of silence settles over the town. People close doors earlier than usual. Children are called inside before darkness fully arrives. The cemetery itself becomes a place few want to visit after sunset. But somewhere in the distance, long after the lamps inside houses have been extinguished, the faint creak of wooden wheels moves along a road. A wagon, moving slowly. Lantern light flickers against the side of the cart. The driver does not speak. The horse pulls the wagon toward the edge of another burial ground. The wheels stop. A shovel slides off the side of the wagon and lands softly in the dirt. The lantern swings once in the night air, and the quiet work begins again. What the mourners around the empty coffin do not yet know is this: the stories about the night doctors are not entirely imaginary. Something real is happening in the darkness. But the truth behind it is stranger and more unsettling than the rumors suggest, because the bodies being taken from graves are not disappearing into magic. They are being taken somewhere that needs them, and the reason why will soon pull us out of this cemetery and into a world that most people in the early 1800s never imagined connected to the dead at all. The world of medicine. The wagon disappears down the road long before sunrise. By the time the town begins to stir again, nothing remains except the disturbed grave and the quiet fear left behind. To the people who buried their loved one, the body is simply gone. But somewhere else, many miles away, a different morning is beginning. A lantern burns inside a narrow brick building. Wooden shutters cover the windows. The room smells of oil, ink, and something sharper beneath it. Dozens of young men stand crowded around a long table. Their coats are dark. their notebooks open. At the center of the room lies a human body, still, silent. The professor standing beside the table lifts a metal instrument and begins to speak. He talks about muscles, about nerves, about how the human body moves and fails and heals. The students lean closer, watching carefully, because they are training to become surgeons. And surgery cannot be learned from books alone. It must be practiced on real human bodies. This scene was becoming common in American cities by the late 1700s. Medicine was changing. For centuries, most doctors learned through apprenticeship. A young student followed an experienced physician, watching treatments and gradually attempting procedures under supervision. But by the late 18th century, formal medical schools were beginning to appear. Institutions where anatomy, chemistry, and surgery were taught in structured lectures. One of the earliest and most influential stood in Philadelphia, where medical education developed rapidly during the late 1700s. Soon others followed: Baltimore, Richmond, New Orleans, cities where universities began building lecture halls and anatomical theaters, designed specifically for the study of the human body. At first glance, this shift looked like progress. Doctors wanted to understand disease more clearly. They wanted better surgical techniques. They wanted to train new physicians who could treat injuries and illnesses more effectively. But the progress carried a problem few people wanted to discuss openly. To teach anatomy, a school needed bodies, not drawings, not models, real human bodies. Muscles needed to be studied directly, organs examined, bones separated and measured. Without cadavers, anatomy remained guesswork. The psychological tension in this system appeared quickly. Medical schools were expanding, but the supply of bodies remained extremely small. In most states during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the law allowed dissection only under very narrow circumstances. Usually, only the bodies of executed criminals could legally be used for anatomical study. That might sound sufficient, but executions were rare. A medical school might train dozens of students each year. A single cadaver could not serve them all. As new schools opened and student numbers grew, the gap between supply and demand widened rapidly. Professors needed bodies to teach. Students needed bodies to learn, but the law provided almost none. This imbalance created something that had not existed before: a market. If medical schools needed cadavers badly enough, someone would find a way to provide them. And when legitimate sources failed, illegitimate ones began appearing. The bodies on those anatomical tables often did not arrive through legal channels. They arrived at night, delivered quietly in wagons. The professor in that lecture room does not ask many questions. The cadaver has already been prepared. The students gather around the table and begin their lesson. For them, the body represents knowledge, a chance to understand how bones connect to muscles, how arteries branch through the body, how organs rest within the chest. Some students feel uneasy during their first dissection. Others grow accustomed quickly, but almost none of them know exactly where the body came from. Or if they suspect, they do not speak about it, because the system surrounding medical education has begun to depend on silence. Outside the lecture hall, another group of people has already discovered the truth. The men who retrieve the bodies, they are not professors, not doctors. They work in darkness. They are sometimes called resurrection men. Their job is simple: find fresh graves, Dig quickly. Remove the body and deliver it before dawn. The pay is good. Medical schools rarely advertise the arrangement, but they understand how their supply arrives. The resurrection men understand something else. The dead cannot complain, but the living can. So they choose their targets carefully. Wealthy cemeteries are dangerous. Families with resources can hire guards. Churchyards in affluent neighborhoods often install heavy stone slabs over graves. Digging there risks arrest, so the resurrection men look elsewhere. Poor burial grounds, unprotected graves, communities where families lack the money to guard their dead. And in many cities during the early 19th century, that often meant black cemeteries. The myth of the night doctors begins to shift here. What sounded like ghost stories, whispered among frightened communities, now connects to something real, a supply chain, bodies taken from graves to fill the growing demand inside medical schools. But the truth does not yet travel openly, because the system operates best when no one asks too many questions. The mourners who found the empty coffin earlier that morning still do not know what happened to the body. They only know that something came during the night and took it away. And the rumors they whisper about night doctors, half fear, half guess, carry more truth than they realize. Because the wagon seen moving through the darkness is not searching for ghosts. It is searching for something medicine desperately needs. And the deeper the medical profession grows, the more valuable those bodies become. Which means the quiet trade moving through graveyards at night is only beginning. And the people who dig those graves will soon become known by a name, whispered with equal parts fear and anger. The resurrection men. The wagon that leaves the cemetery before sunrise does not travel far. It does not need to. In many American cities during the early 19th century, the distance between a burial ground and a medical school could be measured in minutes. A narrow street, a river crossing, a quiet alley where no one asks questions. The driver of the wagon understands this geography well, because this is not his first trip. By the time the town wakes, the body taken from the grave is already somewhere else. A back entrance, a side door, sometimes a cellar. The exchange is quick. Money passes from one hand to another. The wagon leaves again before daylight fully arrives. Inside the building, a cadaver appears where none existed the day before. This quiet transaction became the backbone of a profession that few people ever saw clearly. The men who performed this work developed a name: resurrectionists. They did not call themselves thieves. They used the language of their trade carefully. They said they were raising the dead, resurrecting them. The word sounded less criminal, but everyone understood what it meant. Resurrectionists were professional grave robbers, not amateurs, not desperate men acting on impulse. Professionals. They studied burial schedules. They watched funeral processions from a distance. They noted which graves were freshly dug. Timing mattered. A grave disturbed within the first night after burial was easiest to open. The soil remained loose. The coffin lid was still intact. Wait too long and the ground hardened. Wait too long and families might return to check. So the resurrectionists moved quickly. They often worked in pairs or small teams. One man watched the road, another dug. Another handled the body once the coffin was opened. The process was faster than most people imagined. A practiced crew could uncover a coffin, remove the body, and close the grave again in less than 30 minutes. They carried simple tools, shovels, ropes, sometimes hooks. The method was designed to leave the grave looking almost untouched. Instead of digging up the entire coffin, they opened only the upper portion, just enough to pull the body out. Then they replaced the soil quickly, smoothing the surface before leaving. From a distance, the grave looked undisturbed. Only close inspection revealed the truth. The empty coffin discovered the next morning. By the early 1800s, resurrectionists had become a quiet but organized presence in many cities: Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, Richmond. Wherever medical schools expanded, the demand for bodies followed, and wherever demand existed, someone stepped forward to meet it. Some resurrectionists worked independently. Others formed loose networks. Grave robbing became a business. Bodies had prices. A fresh adult cadaver might sell for several dollars, sometimes more if the medical school needed specimens urgently for anatomy classes. The money moved quietly. Medical schools rarely admitted openly where their cadavers came from, but professors understood the reality. Students needed bodies to study. Resurrectionists provided them. The arrangement existed in a shadowy middle space, half tolerated, half denied. Authorities sometimes arrested grave robbers when communities complained loudly enough, but prosecutions were inconsistent, because the same society that condemned grave robbing also relied on the doctors trained through anatomical study, and those doctors needed cadavers. The psychological tension of this system grew stronger with every disturbed grave. Cemeteries, once places of rest, became targets. Families began guarding burial grounds. Some hired night watchmen. Others built heavy iron cages, called mortsafes, over graves to prevent digging. But these protections required money, and money determined which graves remained safe. This is where the story grows darker, because resurrectionists quickly learned a simple truth: not all cemeteries were equally protected. Wealthy burial grounds posed problems: large monuments, stone vaults, families able to pay guards. Digging there risked confrontation, arrest, violence. But other burial grounds had little protection. Small cemeteries belonging to poor communities, burial plots with simple wooden markers, graves where families lacked resources to stand watch night after night. And in many American cities, those burial grounds belonged to black communities. The mid-scene truth becomes clear. Resurrectionists did not target graves randomly. They targeted the vulnerable. Enslaved people rarely had the power to guard burial grounds. Free black communities often lacked the resources to hire protection. Even when they suspected grave robbing, their complaints carried less weight with authorities. So the pattern repeated, night after night. Fresh graves disturbed, bodies removed, communities waking to empty coffins. The fear of the night doctors spread rapidly through these neighborhoods. Parents warned children not to walk alone after sunset. Families buried loved ones deeper than usual. Some even kept watch through the night, sitting beside fresh graves with lanterns and tools, because they understood something important. The resurrectionists were not searching randomly. They were searching where resistance was weakest. Inside the wagon rolling through the darkness, the body taken from the cemetery lies covered with cloth. The driver does not look at it. He focuses on the road ahead. Because this delivery must reach its destination before daylight, inside the medical school, students will soon gather again around the table. Another lesson, another dissection, another body whose journey from grave to lecture hall will remain mostly unspoken. But the communities losing their dead are beginning to connect the pattern. What once sounded like superstition is becoming something more specific. The night doctors are not spirits. They are men with shovels, men with wagons, men who understand exactly how valuable the dead have become. And the deeper this hidden trade grows, the more it begins to reveal something even more unsettling, because once bodies become valuable enough to steal, the question slowly emerges in frightened whispers across enslaved communities. What stops someone from taking the living too? The question spreads quietly through black neighborhoods. At first it moves as a rumor, a warning passed from porch to porch, from church steps to burial grounds. Not every grave is being disturbed, only certain ones, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. In many American cities during the early 19th century, families begin noticing the same terrible detail. The graves most often opened belonged to black people. Not always, but often enough that fear turns into suspicion, and suspicion slowly hardens into understanding. Because grave robbers are not choosing randomly. They are choosing the places where resistance will be weakest, where the law is least likely to intervene, where the dead can be taken with the smallest chance of consequence. This realization carries a deep emotional unease. In many cultures, burial represents a final promise. A person's body returns to the earth. The community gathers, words are spoken, songs rise and fall over fresh soil. Whatever happened in life, the dead are supposed to rest. But in early 19th century America, that promise was not equally protected. Black burial grounds were often located on the edges of cities. Small plots of land set aside near churches or behind neighborhoods. Some belonged to free black communities. Others served enslaved populations forced to bury their dead away from plantation houses. The markers were simple: wooden boards, rough stones, sometimes nothing at all. These cemeteries held enormous emotional importance to the people who used them. They were places where families could mourn without supervision, places where African traditions sometimes blended quietly with Christian practices. Songs, prayers, stories told over graves. In a society that denied so much dignity in life, burial offered one moment of communal respect. But these cemeteries also lacked the protections common in wealthier burial grounds. No iron gates, no hired guards, no heavy stone vaults sealing coffins underground. And resurrectionists understood this immediately. To them, these burial grounds represented the lowest risk, few witnesses, limited security, authorities less likely to respond aggressively if a grave was disturbed. This is where grave robbing intersects with the deeper structure of American society. The trade in stolen bodies did not exist in isolation. It grew within a system already shaped by racial hierarchy and unequal protection under the law. Communities without political power found their cemeteries targeted again and again. Families began taking precautions. Some returned to graves days after burial, checking the soil for signs of disturbance. Others placed heavy boards across the ground above the coffin. Sometimes groups of men stayed overnight near fresh graves, carrying lanterns and tools. These efforts slowed the resurrectionists, but did not stop them. Because the grave robbers adapted, they watched from a distance, waited for the vigil to end, returned days later when the ground hardened and attention faded, and the fear spread beyond the burial grounds themselves, because the theft of bodies carried a deeper insult. It suggested that even in death, black people could be treated as objects, as resources. as something useful for someone else's education. This realization produced anger that grew quietly beneath the surface. Occasionally, the anger broke into open confrontation. One of the earliest documented incidents occurred in Philadelphia in the late 18th century. In 1788, rumors spread through the city that medical students had stolen bodies from black cemeteries for anatomical study. A crowd gathered outside a medical school. People demanded answers. Some witnesses claimed they saw human remains displayed in ways that appeared disrespectful. The crowd grew larger. Soon hundreds of residents surrounded the building. What followed became known as the Doctors' Riot of 1788. Angry citizens forced their way inside. They destroyed anatomical equipment. Medical students fled through windows and back doors. Authorities eventually restored order, but the message was clear. Communities were beginning to resist the hidden trade in bodies. Similar tensions appeared elsewhere. In Baltimore, New York, and other cities where medical schools expanded, each time the same pattern emerged. Graves disturbed, rumors spreading, communities realizing that their burial grounds were being watched by men who moved through cemeteries at night. The psychological tension deepened. Because these incidents blurred the line between rumor and reality, people had long whispered about night doctors, mysterious figures who stole bodies. Now those whispers had evidence: empty coffins, witnesses seeing wagons near graveyards after midnight, medical schools receiving cadavers no one could explain. The myth was shifting again. The night doctors were no longer imagined figures from frightening stories. They were connected to something larger, an entire system linking cemeteries to lecture halls, grave robbers to surgeons, and black communities to the darkest corner of that system. The more families realized this, the more their fear changed shape. At first, the fear focused on graves: protect the cemetery, guard the burial ground. But a new thought began moving through conversations in quiet tones. If men were willing to dig up the dead, if bodies had become valuable enough to steal, what would stop someone from taking a body before it ever reached the grave? The question unsettled even those who had never witnessed such a crime, because it hinted at something worse than grave robbing, something that moved the story beyond cemeteries and into the streets themselves. And the next stage of the night doctor's legend would grow from that fear. A fear that spread through enslaved communities as quickly as any rumor. The fear that the wagon in the dark might not be waiting for the dead, but for the living. The fear does not stay inside the cemeteries. It travels from burial grounds to churchyards, from kitchen fires to fields, from one whispered warning to another. Soon, the story changes shape. People begin speaking about night doctors not only as grave robbers, but as figures who move through the night looking for bodies, and not always dead ones. The stories spread through enslaved communities slowly at first. They moved through the spaces where news often traveled safest, between workers walking home after sunset, inside cabins after long days in the fields, among children listening quietly while adults speak in lowered voices. No one tells these stories casually. They are shared carefully, because fear alone is not the purpose. The purpose is protection. A mother calls her children inside earlier than usual. A father warns his son not to walk the road after dark. An elder leans closer to the fire and says quietly, "Don't let them catch you alone at night." The words night doctors begin appearing more often in these conversations. The name itself carries uncertainty. No one seems entirely sure who first used it, but the meaning becomes widely understood. Men connected to medical schools, men who steal bodies, men who come at night. And over time, the rumors expand beyond what people can prove. Grave robbing remains real. Disturbed cemeteries provide clear evidence. But the stories surrounding the night doctors grow larger than the evidence. Some say the men carry sacks. Others say they use wagons that move quietly through town streets after midnight. A few claim they drug victims before taking them away. No one can confirm every detail, but the fear becomes powerful enough that communities begin organizing their behavior around it. Children are told never to walk alone after sunset. Young men travel in groups. Families avoid certain roads after dark. In many ways, these stories function like an informal warning system. Folklore becomes a kind of social protection, because in enslaved communities, official protection rarely exists. The law does not always defend them. Authorities may ignore their complaints. So knowledge travels through memory instead. Stories, songs, warnings repeated across generations. This pattern appears in many cultures facing danger. Information moves through narrative because narrative survives longer than formal records. The psychological tension inside these stories becomes clear. The night doctors represent something larger than grave robbing. They symbolize the possibility that black bodies, living or dead, can be taken without consent, and history had already provided reasons for that fear. Medical experimentation on enslaved people had occurred before. Some physicians conducted procedures on enslaved patients because enslavers controlled their bodies. These experiments did not always involve kidnapping, but they demonstrated how easily medical authority could intersect with power over vulnerable populations. That memory fed the stories spreading through enslaved communities. When people heard about medical schools needing bodies, when they saw graves disturbed, when wagons moved through neighborhoods late at night, the connection formed quickly. Maybe the doctors were not waiting for bodies to die. Maybe they were collecting them. Whether those fears reflected documented cases or expanding rumor is difficult to measure today. Historical records provide clear evidence of grave robbing. Evidence of widespread kidnapping for medical dissection is far less certain, but the power of the night doctor's legend does not depend entirely on documented cases. It depends on something deeper: trust, or the absence of it. When a community believes the institutions around them do not protect them, rumors fill the gaps where trust should be. The night doctor's stories express that gap clearly. They transform grave robbers into something larger, a symbol of vulnerability, a warning about the dangers moving through the night. And the stories spread beyond enslaved communities as well. Free black communities in northern cities hear similar warnings. In Baltimore, in Philadelphia, in New York, parents tell children to stay close to home after sunset. Travelers speak cautiously about certain neighborhoods. Church gatherings include quiet conversations about disturbed graves and suspicious wagons. The folklore grows stronger with each retelling, but it also becomes something else, a survival tool. The stories keep people alert. They encourage groups to move together rather than alone. They make communities watchful. In this way, fear becomes a form of defense. Not perfect, but better than silence. The night doctors themselves remain difficult to identify. Resurrectionists continue their work. Medical schools continue receiving cadavers. But the legend surrounding those activities now spreads through the South and North alike. And once a legend enters community memory, it rarely stays confined to its original shape, because the next stage of the Night Doctor's story moves beyond fear. It moves into confrontation. Communities that once whispered warnings begin demanding answers. Graves have been disturbed too many times. Bodies have disappeared too often. And somewhere between rumor and evidence, a deeper truth begins emerging. The Night Doctor's legend is not just about fear of the unknown. It is about the moment a community realizes that the system around them may not protect their dead or their living. And when that realization settles in, something else begins to grow beside fear: anger. The kind of anger that eventually demands to know exactly who has been moving through the cemeteries at night. The anger growing inside those communities does not come from rumor alone. Some fears are rooted in things people have already seen, because long before the phrase Night Doctors began spreading through whispered warnings, enslaved people had already experienced something deeply unsettling about the way medicine sometimes treated them. Not every doctor behaved this way. Some physicians treated enslaved patients with care. Others genuinely believed they were advancing knowledge that might eventually save lives. But within the structure of slavery, medical authority often intersected with power in troubling ways. The system created patients who could not refuse. People whose bodies were controlled by enslavers. People who could be brought to doctors not because they volunteered, but because someone else decided they should. And once that reality existed, certain physicians began using it. One of the most discussed examples comes from the mid-19th century. A physician named Dr. J. Marion Sims, practicing in Alabama during the 1840s, became known for developing surgical techniques intended to repair a painful childbirth injury known as vesicovaginal fistula. The condition left women incontinent and socially isolated. Doctors struggled for years to find an effective treatment. Sims believed he could solve the problem, but the way he pursued that solution has remained controversial ever since. Several enslaved women, whose names included Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, were subjected to repeated surgical operations, while Sims attempted to refine his technique. Historical records show that these procedures occurred without anesthesia. At the time, anesthesia was still new and not widely adopted in surgical practice. But the fact remains that the women endured multiple operations under painful conditions. Sims documented his work carefully. In medical journals, he described the procedures as breakthroughs, and in time, the technique he developed did become widely used in gynecological surgery. But the women whose bodies made those experiments possible had little power to refuse. They were enslaved. Their owners allowed the procedures. Their consent, as modern medicine understands it, was not part of the equation. This example does not represent every doctor in 19th century America, nor does it prove that night doctors were routinely kidnapping people for experiments. But it demonstrates something important. Medical progress sometimes occurred inside a system that treated certain bodies as available for experimentation, and enslaved communities understood this reality. Even if they never read the medical journals describing it, people saw enslaved patients brought to physicians repeatedly. They saw surgical procedures performed. They saw individuals returning from those procedures injured, exhausted, or changed. And in a society where enslaved people lacked legal control over their own bodies, the boundaries between treatment and experimentation could become dangerously thin. This is where the psychological tension deepens. The rumors of night doctors do not emerge from pure imagination. They grow from lived experience combined with incomplete information. When communities already know that doctors sometimes operate on enslaved patients without full consent, when they hear about graves being robbed to supply anatomy schools, when wagons move quietly through neighborhoods at night, the line separating rumor from possibility becomes difficult to see clearly. Fear fills the spaces where facts remain uncertain. Some enslaved people began avoiding doctors altogether, unless absolutely necessary. Others relied on community healers, herbal knowledge, midwives, spiritual practices. These alternatives offered care within systems where trust still existed. Because trust, once broken, does not repair easily, and medical authority in the 19th century often struggled with that problem. Doctors believed they were advancing science. Communities sometimes saw something different. They saw bodies being used for dissection, used for experimentation, used without permission. In that environment, the night doctor's legend continued to grow. It expanded beyond graveyards and surgical rooms. The fear transformed into a broader warning. Be careful around unfamiliar doctors. Be cautious about hospitals. Watch the wagons that move after midnight. From the outside, these warnings might appear exaggerated, but inside communities that had witnessed both grave robbing and exploitative medical practices, the fears made a certain kind of sense. The myth shift becomes clear here. The night doctors are no longer imagined as simple grave robbers. They represent the darker side of medicine itself. A profession capable of healing, but also capable of exploiting the powerless. And the deeper the legend spreads, the harder it becomes to separate what people know from what they fear might be happening. Because when stories of grave robbing meet stories of painful experiments, something new forms. A narrative powerful enough to travel across generations. A warning whispered to children long after the wagons stop rolling through cemeteries. But the night doctor's legend does not remain only a story about fear. Eventually, communities begin demanding answers. And once the public begins asking questions about where medical schools obtain their cadavers, the hidden trade that supported anatomical study starts becoming harder to hide, which forces the system behind it into the open. And when that happens, the story enters a new phase, one where the truth about the night doctors becomes more complicated and more visible than anyone expected. The rumors about stolen bodies do not stay quiet forever. At some point, fear turns into anger. And anger, once it gathers enough people in one place, becomes something far more dangerous. In the spring of 1788, New York City was already tense. The city was growing quickly. Ships crowded its harbor. Trade flowed through its streets. And like many cities of the time, it contained a new and increasingly powerful institution, a medical school. Students studying anatomy had begun working inside rooms where human bodies were dissected for training. Officially, the supply of cadavers was limited. The law allowed dissection primarily for executed criminals. But New York, like other cities, did not execute enough prisoners to supply the growing number of medical students, which meant the same hidden system that existed elsewhere had begun operating here as well. Graves were being disturbed, bodies disappeared. People whispered about resurrectionists working for the medical schools. At first, these whispers moved quietly through neighborhoods. especially among poorer communities whose burial grounds were most vulnerable. But rumors have a way of spreading beyond their original circles. Soon the fear reached docks, markets, taverns, and churches. People began watching cemeteries more carefully. Families checked graves after burial, and each time disturbed soil appeared, the anger deepened. Then one afternoon in April 1788, something happened that pushed the tension over the edge. The story survives in several versions, but the central moment appears in multiple historical accounts. A group of boys were playing outside the New York hospital, where medical students conducted anatomical studies. One of them climbed close enough to see through a window. Inside, he saw a human body being dissected. The sight alone was disturbing, but what happened next triggered something much larger. According to reports, a medical student working inside lifted a severed arm and waved it toward the boy outside. Some accounts say he called out mockingly. Others say the gesture was meant as a joke. Either way, the message landed badly. The boy ran home and told his father what he had seen, and the father recognized something immediately. His wife had recently died. She had been buried only days earlier. Suddenly, a terrifying possibility formed in his mind. Had someone taken her body? The man rushed to the cemetery. Neighbors followed. When they opened the grave, they discovered something that confirmed their worst fear. The coffin was empty. News spread through the neighborhood faster than anyone could control. Within hours, crowds gathered outside the hospital. Hundreds of people, then more. Laborers, dock workers, residents who had already heard rumors about stolen bodies. The anger that had been building quietly now erupted. The crowd demanded answers. They shouted for the doctors to come outside. They accused the medical students of grave robbing. Inside the building, the students panicked. Some attempted to hide anatomical specimens. Others fled through back doors and windows. But the crowd outside continued to grow. By evening, the confrontation had become impossible to contain. The mob forced its way into the hospital. They smashed windows, they overturned tables. Human remains discovered inside the building confirmed what many had feared. Bodies, bones, parts of cadavers stored for anatomical study. The sight only intensified the rage. The crowd dragged some remains into the street. Medical equipment was destroyed. Students ran for safety. Local authorities attempted to restore order. But the situation had moved beyond a simple protest. Over the next several days, violence spread through parts of New York City. Crowds attacked buildings connected to physicians. Doctors feared for their lives. Some hid in their homes. Others fled the city temporarily. Eventually, militia units were called to control the unrest. Confrontations between soldiers and rioters resulted in injuries and several deaths. The event became known as the Doctors' Riot of 1788, one of the earliest large-scale public uprisings in the young United States. The emotional focus of the riot was not simply anger toward medical schools. It reflected something deeper. A belief that the dead were not being treated with dignity, a fear that poor communities, and particularly black burial grounds, were being targeted for bodies. The myth shift becomes clear here. The fear of grave robbing was not limited to enslaved people or marginalized neighborhoods. It spread across society. Laborers, immigrants, free black communities, even some middle-class families, all recognized the possibility that their loved ones might be taken after burial. And once that realization spread, the hidden system supporting anatomical education became much harder to ignore. Public outrage forced lawmakers to respond. In the years following the riot, several states began passing new laws regulating how medical schools could obtain bodies for dissection. Some legislation allowed the use of unclaimed bodies from hospitals or prisons. The goal was to reduce grave robbing by providing legal sources. But those laws also introduced new ethical questions, because once again, the bodies most often used came from people with the least social protection. The poor, the imprisoned, the marginalized. Still, the doctors' riot marked a turning point. Communities had pushed back. The hidden trade in cadavers had been dragged into public view, and the night doctor's legend, once dismissed by some as exaggerated rumor, now stood partially confirmed. Bodies had been stolen. Medical schools had benefited from the theft, and when the public learned the truth, they had fought back. But even after the riot, the stories about night doctors did not disappear, because the deeper fear was never only about grave robbing. It was about what happened when science advanced inside a society where not everybody carried equal protection. And that question would continue echoing long after the riot ended, leaving historians and communities still debating where the boundary lies between necessary knowledge and unacceptable exploitation. The violence of the doctors' riot left something behind that no one in power could ignore. For decades, grave robbing had existed in a kind of uneasy silence. Communities suspected it. Doctors depended on it. Authorities looked the other way when the problem stayed quiet. But once the anger spilled into the streets of New York in 1788, crowds smashed medical schools and demanded answers. The system that supplied anatomical study could no longer remain invisible. Something had to change. Not because the public suddenly rejected medical education. Most people understood that surgeons needed to study the human body. They understood that anatomy helped doctors save lives. But the riot revealed a crisis of trust. People feared what might happen to their bodies after death. Families feared burying loved ones only to have them stolen before mourning. And communities already pushed to the margins, especially black communities, knew they were the easiest targets. If medicine wanted to continue teaching anatomy, it needed a new system for obtaining cadavers. The reckoning that followed unfolded slowly through the 19th century. Lawmakers began confronting a question that earlier generations had avoided. Where should medical schools legally obtain the bodies they needed? At the time, the law provided only a very narrow answer. Most American states allowed dissection only for the bodies of executed criminals. The logic came from older European traditions. Public execution carried humiliation beyond death. Dissection became part of that punishment. But executions were rare. A growing medical school might train dozens, sometimes hundreds of students each year. One or two bodies from criminal executions could not supply that demand. So resurrectionists filled the gap. The riots, protests, and public outrage forced governments to reconsider the rules. One by one, states began passing new laws designed to regulate anatomical study. These laws would eventually become known broadly as Anatomy Acts. The idea behind them was simple. If medical schools had legal access to bodies, they would no longer rely on grave robbers. In theory, this would protect cemeteries and restore public trust. But the question remained, whose bodies would the law allow doctors to use? In many places, the answer revealed the same social inequalities that had shaped grave robbing itself. The new laws often allowed medical schools to receive unclaimed bodies, people who died in public hospitals, residents of poorhouses, prisoners who died without family claiming their remains, individuals whose relatives could not afford burial. From the perspective of lawmakers, this solution seemed practical. Unclaimed bodies had previously been buried at public expense. Now they could be used for anatomical education instead, but the policy carried consequences that communities quickly noticed, because the people most likely to die unclaimed were often the poorest members of society: immigrants, laborers, the homeless, and disproportionately people of color. In other words, the new legal system reduced grave robbing, but it did not remove inequality from the supply of cadavers. It simply moved the process from hidden theft to official allocation. This shift marks an important moment in the history of medicine. For the first time, the law openly acknowledged the demand for bodies in anatomical education. Medical schools no longer needed to pretend that cadavers appeared mysteriously. Governments created legal pathways to supply them. In states such as Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania, anatomy laws passed throughout the 19th century attempted to regulate the process. Records were sometimes required. Bodies had to be documented. Medical schools faced restrictions on how long they could retain remains. Some laws attempted to ensure that bodies were treated respectfully after dissection. These reforms did reduce the need for resurrectionists. Grave robbing did not disappear entirely, but it became less common where legal cadaver supplies existed. Still, the psychological tension never fully vanished. Because communities remembered the earlier decades, they remembered disturbed graves, empty coffins, rumors about night doctors moving through cemeteries under cover of darkness. Even after anatomy laws attempted to regulate the system, those memories lingered. Stories passed from one generation to the next. Parents continued warning children about strangers at night. Families remained cautious about hospitals and medical institutions. Trust, once broken, does not return quickly. And the legacy of the night doctors would live far longer than the resurrectionists themselves. The myth shift becomes clear in this moment of reform. What began as secret grave robbing eventually forced a public conversation about ethics, law, and the value of human remains. Medical education evolved. Legal frameworks developed. But the reforms also revealed something uncomfortable. Even when governments tried to fix the problem, the bodies most often used for medical study still belonged to the most vulnerable members of society: the poor, the imprisoned, those who died without family to defend their burial, which raises a question historians continue to explore. Did the Anatomy Acts truly solve the crisis of body theft? Or did they simply replace an illegal system with a legal one built on similar inequalities? Either way, the night doctor's legend had already taken root. Long after the laws changed, the stories continued traveling through communities. Stories about wagons in the dark, about graves opened before sunrise, about doctors whose knowledge came from bodies taken without permission. And those stories would shape something important, not just folklore, but the way entire communities understood medicine itself. A legacy of fear and caution that would echo through generations. Because once people believe their bodies might not belong to them even after death, the relationship between medicine and trust becomes far more complicated. And that complicated history would continue influencing how many communities approached hospitals, doctors, and medical institutions Long after the 19th century came to an end, the wagons eventually stop coming. The resurrection men fade from the streets. Medical schools develop new systems for obtaining cadavers. By the late 19th century, the old trade in stolen bodies has largely disappeared from public life, but something else remains. The stories long after the grave robbers vanish. The warnings continue traveling through families and communities. Children still hear about night doctors. Grandparents still repeat the same advice, once whispered generations earlier. Be careful where you go after dark. Don't trust every doctor who claims to help. Watch the roads at night. These stories survive, even when the events that inspired them grow distant. That survival tells us something important about how communities remember history. Because the night doctor's legend did not endure simply because people enjoyed frightening stories. It endured because the fear carried truth inside it. The legend preserved a memory of vulnerability, a memory that black bodies, living or dead, had once been treated as resources within systems of power. The emotional focus here shifts from fear to cultural memory. Stories become a way to carry experiences that official history often ignored. In many African American communities, folklore served a deeper purpose than entertainment. It passed along warnings. It preserved lessons. It helped explain dangers that were difficult to discuss openly in certain times and places. The Night Doctor's story joined a long tradition of protective storytelling. Just as enslaved people once shared coded songs to signal escape routes, just as elders used folktales to teach children how to navigate hostile environments, the Night Doctor's legend carried its own message. Stay alert, be cautious around institutions that hold power over your body. That message did not appear without reason. Throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th, African American communities experienced repeated moments when medical authority intersected with racial inequality, not always through grave robbing, but through other forms of exploitation. Hospitals that refused black patients, medical schools that relied disproportionately on the bodies of poor and marginalized people, experiments conducted without proper consent. Each of these experiences reinforced the memory embedded in the Night Doctor's story. Even when the original resurrectionists disappeared, the underlying concern remained. Who controls the human body? Who decides how it can be used? Who receives protection and who does not? The psychological tension carried by the legend reflects those unanswered questions. For many communities, the Night Doctor's story became a symbolic explanation for broader patterns of medical mistrust. People did not always separate folklore from documented history. The stories and the evidence blended together, and sometimes that blending helped preserve truths that formal records overlooked. Historians studying the legend have found versions of the Night Doctor's story across many regions of the United States. In the rural South, in cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, in neighborhoods where African American families passed down the warning through generations, the details change from place to place. Some versions describe wagons collecting bodies. Others speak of doctors capturing victims for experiments. A few stories merge grave robbing with kidnapping, but the core idea remains consistent. Medicine possessed power, and that power had once been used without respect for black lives. The myth shift here becomes subtle but powerful. The Night Doctors are no longer understood only as specific men stealing bodies. They become symbols, representations of a historical imbalance between medical authority and vulnerable communities. Symbols often survive longer than the events that created them, because they continue explaining patterns people recognize in the world around them. This helps explain why the Night Doctor's legend remained alive well into the 20th century. Even as modern medical ethics improved, even as new regulations governed research and patient consent, the memory of earlier abuses lingered. Stories continued traveling through families. Some children grew up believing night doctors still roamed the streets. Others understood the story more metaphorically, as a warning about institutions that demanded trust before earning it. The legend's endurance reveals something about the relationship between history and memory. Official documents may record laws, medical advancements, and scientific discoveries, but communities often remember history differently. Through stories, through caution, through the lessons passed quietly from one generation to the next. And sometimes those stories preserve emotional truths that statistics alone cannot capture. The Night Doctor's legend carries one of those truths. That fear of exploitation can survive long after the exploitation itself changes form. That cultural memory keeps watch even when official narratives move on. And that the relationship between medicine and trust must be built carefully. Because once communities lose confidence in those who claim authority over the human body, restoring that trust can take generations. The wagons in the dark may belong to the past, but the question they raised remains: how do societies ensure that the pursuit of knowledge never again crosses the line into exploitation? The Night Doctor's legend continues asking that question long after the graves stopped opening. And perhaps that is why the story refused to disappear, because sometimes folklore survives not to frighten people, but to remind them. Night settles slowly over a cemetery. No lanterns burn tonight. No wagons wait on the road. Only rows of stones, some tall and polished, others worn smooth by weather, and between them, stretches of earth where names were never carved at all. The wind moves gently through the trees. Grass bends, then becomes still again. In places like this, history often feels quiet, but the silence carries weight, because beneath the soil lie the bodies that built much of what modern medicine understands about the human body. The moral reckoning begins here. When historians look back at the development of modern anatomy and surgery, they see extraordinary progress. Doctors learned how organs function. Surgeons refined techniques that would eventually save millions of lives. Medical schools expanded knowledge about infection, trauma, childbirth, and disease. The anatomical study that once required stolen cadavers eventually became the foundation for nearly every medical advancement that followed. But beneath that progress lies a difficult truth. Many of the bodies that made these discoveries possible were never meant to be there. Some were taken from graves without permission. Others belonged to the poor, the imprisoned, or the unclaimed people, whose deaths placed them inside systems that offered little protection. And for Black communities in particular, the legacy of body theft and exploitation created a wound that stretched far beyond the 19th century. The names of famous physicians remain well recorded in history. Medical textbooks remember them. Hospitals bear their names. Statues sometimes stand in their honor. But the individuals whose bodies lay on the anatomical tables rarely appear in those same records. They are often described simply as cadavers or specimens, anonymous, unidentified. The historical layer here is uncomfortable but important. Modern medicine did not emerge from theory alone. It developed through direct study of human bodies. And for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the legal and ethical systems governing that study were incomplete. In some cases, openly unjust. Communities with the least social protection provided the largest share of bodies for dissection. The poor, the imprisoned, the marginalized, people whose deaths did not carry the same public attention as wealthier citizens. The psychological tension this creates is not about rejecting medical progress. Most people recognize the extraordinary benefits that anatomy and surgery have produced. Antibiotics, life-saving operations, understanding of disease, modern hospitals capable of treating injuries that once guaranteed death. But recognizing those benefits does not erase the question of how the knowledge was obtained. The Night Doctor's legend sits precisely at that intersection. For many years, historians dismissed the stories as exaggerations, ghost stories shaped by fear. But as research expanded, scholars began recognizing that the folklore preserved pieces of real history. Grave robbing did occur. Medical schools did rely on stolen bodies during certain periods. Communities did protest and resist when they discovered what was happening. And the stories told by families, stories about wagons in the night and disturbed graves, captured a truth that official records often softened or ignored. The myth shift becomes clear here. The Night Doctor's legend is no longer understood only as superstition. It becomes a kind of testimony, a cultural record of how communities experienced medical power during a time when the law did not protect them equally. Folklore becomes historical evidence of memory, and memory becomes part of the broader story of medicine itself. In recent decades, historians, medical schools, and museums have begun acknowledging these complicated origins more openly. Some institutions have attempted to identify the remains used in early anatomical collections. Others have created memorials honoring the unnamed individuals whose bodies contributed to medical education. These efforts do not erase the past, but they attempt to recognize it honestly, because the relationship between science and ethics evolves over time. Modern medicine now operates under strict principles of informed consent, patient autonomy, and research oversight. Medical students still study anatomy, but today those bodies are donated voluntarily by individuals who choose to contribute to education after death. That choice represents a fundamental change. Consent replaces theft, transparency replaces secrecy, respect replaces the hidden trade that once moved through cemeteries at night. Still, the legacy of the earlier era remains part of the historical record, and acknowledging that legacy matters, because every field that advances through human experience carries responsibility for remembering how that knowledge was obtained. The Night Doctor's legend survives not simply because it frightens people. It survives because it asks a question that science must continue answering carefully. Who benefits from progress and who pays the cost? The final moral dilemma sits quietly within that question. If medical progress depended, at least in part, on bodies taken without consent, who receives credit for the discoveries that followed, and who remains unnamed beneath the soil? History often remembers the pioneers, the surgeons, the professors, the inventors of new techniques, but beneath the quiet cemeteries of early America lie people whose names never entered medical textbooks. People whose bodies became part of a system that transformed medicine. Without recognition, without consent, without choice. The wind moves again through the trees. Night settles deeper across the cemetery. No footsteps approach the graves now. No lantern light moves through the rows. The wagon roads are empty, but the silence that remains carries memory. Fresh soil once turned here. Coffins once opened under the cover of darkness. Stories once spread through communities trying to understand what was happening to their dead. And those stories refuse to disappear, because sometimes the quietest places remember the most. A cemetery at night, stillness, the kind of silence that holds history. The kind that refuses to forget. Before you leave this story behind, sit with one question for a moment. Everything you just heard leads back to it. Modern medicine has saved countless lives. Surgeries that once seemed impossible are now routine. Doctors can repair organs, stop infections, and heal injuries that would have meant death only a few centuries ago. But part of that knowledge came from bodies that never gave permission. People buried with families who expected them to rest in peace. People whose graves were opened in the dark. People whose names rarely appeared in the records that celebrated the doctors who studied them. So here is the question I want you to answer honestly. If medical progress saved millions of lives, but some of that knowledge came from bodies taken without consent, how should history remember those unnamed people? As victims, as unwilling contributors to science, or as forgotten builders of modern medicine? There is no easy answer, but your answer matters. Tell me what you think in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Because the more voices that join these conversations, the harder it becomes for stories like this to stay buried. And here, on Unrecorded Histories They Tried to Bury, we make sure they never are.